What if I told you that America's kitchens once held secrets so sweet, so inventive, that they've almost vanished from memory? Recipes passed from mother to daughter, written on yellowed index cards, and tucked inside the pages of Betty Crocker's famous cookbooks. Today, we're unlocking those forgotten treasures. These weren't just recipes, they were survival tools, comfort foods, and little celebrations during times when families had to make do with whatever they had. Imagine fluffy dumplings bubbling in brown sugar syrup, or potato donuts fried from leftover mash. These dishes weren't born out of luxury, they were born out of necessity, creativity, and the sheer will to make something wonderful out of almost nothing. Betty Crocker wasn't a real person, but her recipes became the heartbeat of millions of American households. She represented hope, warmth, and that comforting sense of home. For families struggling during the Depression, or trying to stretch every meal in the 1940s and 50s, her creations weren't just food, they were memories in the making. And yet, as time marched on, these recipes began to disappear. The dumplings gave way to boxed desserts, the salmon loaf was forgotten in favor of fast food, and tea breads and cornflake macaroons were quietly pushed aside by modern baking trends. But today, we're bringing them back. From the curious to the comforting, from sweet to savory, these 10 forgotten Betty Crocker recipes tell the story of how America once cooked, shared, and lived. So grab a seat at the table, hit that subscribe button if you love food history, and join me as we rediscover the flavors your grandparents knew, but you probably don't. Brown sugar dumplings. Picture this, a chilly evening in the 1930s, when sugar was precious and desserts weren't guaranteed. Families would gather around the kitchen table, waiting for a pot to bubble with something sweet, simple, and comforting. That's where brown sugar dumplings made their quiet entrance. This wasn't a fancy dessert. It was born out of frugality, an answer to tight budgets and limited ingredients. Instead of cakes that required costly butter or pies needing fresh fruit, homemakers turned to flour, baking powder, and a cup of brown sugar. The magic happened when doughy dumplings were dropped into simmering syrup, made from little more than sugar, water, and sometimes a splash of vanilla. The result? Pillowy bites soaked in caramel-like sweetness, a treat that felt indulgent even in the hardest times. For children, this dessert was pure wonder. The steam rising from the pot carried a smell that promised comfort. Mothers would ladle out soft dumplings glistening with syrup, and families would savor every bite as though it were a luxury. In truth, it was because in an era when treats were scarce, even the simplest dessert carried a taste of celebration. Brown sugar dumplings were also a reflection of American ingenuity. Housewives learned how to stretch every ingredient, transforming pantry basics into something memorable. These dumplings weren't just food, they were a reminder that sweetness could be created, even when life wasn't sweet. Today, they're almost forgotten, tucked away in vintage cookbooks. But if you've ever wondered what dessert tasted like in Depression-era kitchens, brown sugar dumplings tell the story perfectly. Simple, resourceful, and deeply nostalgic, they remind us of a time when joy was stirred into every pot. Hamburger stretch-a-mealed loaf. During the 1940s and 1950s, America's dinner tables faced a challenge. How do you feed a hungry family when meat is scarce, expensive, or rationed? The answer came in clever creations like Betty Crocker's hamburger stretch-a-mealed loaf. This dish wasn't just food, it was strategy. Ground beef, the star protein of working-class kitchens, was often too costly to serve in generous portions. So homemakers found ways to stretch it by blending it with fillers like breadcrumbs, oats, or even mashed potatoes. In this recipe, seasoned ground beef was spread over slices of sandwich bread, often topped with tomato or onion, and baked until the loaf transformed into something hearty and satisfying. The beauty of this loaf was its dual role. It made a little meat go a long way, while still giving families the feeling of enjoying a proper, filling dinner. For children, it looked like a casserole meat sandwich hybrid. For parents, it meant 1 pound of hamburger could serve 6 instead of 3. In those post-war years, that mattered. Around the table, the dish carried a sense of comfort. The smell of baking bread mingled with savory beef and spices, filling the home with warmth. Every slice told the story of practicality, of mothers and fathers determined to nourish their families while keeping budgets intact. Today, the stretcher meal loaf has nearly vanished, replaced by fast food burgers and frozen dinners. Yet, its legacy lives on as a symbol of mid-century resilience. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, filling, and a reminder that creativity in the kitchen could make any dinner feel abundant. Forgotten by most, this dish reflects an era when every meal was carefully planned, stretched, and savored. Potato donuts, mashed potato rings. In the early to mid-20th century, nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Leftovers weren't scraps, they were opportunities. That's exactly how potato donuts, sometimes called mashed potato rings, found their way into American homes. The recipe was clever and resourceful. Instead of throwing away cold mashed potatoes from last night's dinner, homemakers would mix them with flour, sugar, eggs, and a touch of nutmeg. The dough was rolled, cut into rings, and dropped into hot oil until golden and crisp. The result? A donut that was lighter, fluffier, and far less expensive than anything from a bakery. Children especially adored these donuts. Imagine waking up to the smell of frying batter on a Saturday morning, watching rings of dough bob in sizzling oil before being dusted in powdered sugar or cinnamon. For many kids, it was the closest thing to carnival food right at home, made from yesterday's leftovers. But these weren't just treats, they were symbols of practicality during lean times. During the Depression and even into the war years, families stretched every ingredient. Potatoes, cheap and filling, became a backbone of the American diet. Transforming them into donuts was a stroke of genius, thrifty, delicious, and fun. Served warm, these donuts carried a comforting sweetness that masked the hardships of the era. Around the table, families laughed and shared stories, each bite reminding them that joy could still be created from the simplest things. Today, potato donuts have all but disappeared from American kitchens. Replaced by store-bought sweets, they linger only in old cookbooks and the memories of those who grew up with them. But if you've ever wanted to taste true Depression-era creativity, these donuts are a forgotten treasure worth remembering. Salmon loaf with cucumber cream. Long before salmon became a luxury item at restaurants, canned salmon was a household staple across mid-century America. Affordable, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, it became the foundation for one of Betty Crocker's most elegant yet practical creations, the salmon loaf with cucumber cream. This dish was more than dinner, it was presentation. In an era when homemakers took pride in serving something that looked refined without straining the budget, the salmon loaf was a star. Made by mixing canned salmon with breadcrumbs, eggs, milk, and seasonings, it was molded into a loaf and baked until firm. The true flourish, however, was the cucumber cream, a cool, tangy sauce made from grated cucumber folded into sour cream or mayonnaise, drizzled over each slice to balance the richness of the fish. For families, this dish carried both practicality and pride. It was inexpensive yet elegant, the kind of meal you could serve on a Sunday table or even to guests without embarrassment. At a time when hospitality mattered, homemakers leaned on recipes like this to transform ordinary ingredients into something extraordinary. Children may not have always loved its fishy aroma, but for parents, it was a point of resourceful creativity. Even more, the salmon loaf echoed the frugality of earlier decades, when stretching canned goods was essential to survival. The cucumber cream added not only freshness but also the illusion of sophistication. Today, the salmon loaf with cucumber cream has quietly disappeared from American kitchens, replaced by quicker seafood options and modern tastes. Yet it stands as a reminder of an era when thrift met elegance, and when even a humble can of salmon could be transformed into a centerpiece. Ham loaf with pineapple mustard glaze. In the mid-20th century, when holiday tables and Sunday dinners called for something special, many families turned not to ham steaks or roasts, but to a dish that's nearly vanished today: ham loaf with pineapple mustard glaze. This recipe took the familiar idea of meatloaf and gave it a sweet and savory twist. Ground ham, often blended with a little pork or veal, was mixed with eggs, breadcrumbs, and milk, then shaped into a loaf and baked until tender. But the real magic came from the glaze. Pineapple juice simmered with tangy mustard created a sticky, golden coating that caramelized over the loaf, turning an ordinary meal into something festive and full of flavor. For many families, this dish carried a sense of celebration. Pineapple, once considered exotic, was a canned luxury that brought brightness to the American table. Paired with mustard sharpness, it struck a balance that felt both comforting and adventurous. The glaze made every slice glisten, giving even the humblest kitchen the feel of a holiday feast. Children loved the sweet, tangy topping, while parents appreciated how far the recipe could stretch leftovers. A slice of cold ham loaf on Monday's lunch plate was as welcome as the warm slices carved fresh from the oven on Sunday night. Like many mid-century creations, though, ham loaf with pineapple mustard glaze has faded into obscurity. Today's diners rarely think of ham in loaf form, and the once novel pineapple glaze has been overshadowed by modern flavors. Yet, this forgotten recipe tells a story of innovation, of homemakers who could transform everyday ingredients into something memorable, cheerful, and uniquely American. Chicken à la king in patty shells. In the golden age of mid-century entertaining, when dinner parties were polished and family meals carried a touch of elegance, few dishes made a statement quite like chicken à la king in patty shells. The recipe itself was a classic example of refinement on a budget. Leftover chicken, often from Sunday roasts, was diced and folded into a rich, creamy sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and broth. To give it flair, colorful additions like pimentos, mushrooms, or peas were stirred in, turning scraps into a dish that looked, and tasted, luxurious. But the true crown jewel was the presentation. The filling was spooned into crisp, golden patty shells, also known as vol au vents, creating a meal that felt restaurant-worthy right at home. For homemakers, this dish carried pride. It wasn't just reheated leftovers, it was transformation. Guests seated at the table would see delicate pastry shells brimming with creamy chicken, and suddenly an ordinary weeknight felt like an occasion. Children, too, loved the flakiness of the shells paired with the velvety sauce, making it one of those rare meals that balanced adult sophistication with kid-friendly comfort. During the 1950s and 1960s, chicken à la king symbolized modern cooking. It appeared in cookbooks, magazines, and even on early airline menus as the picture of American culinary style, rich, impressive, and a little indulgent. Today, though, it has nearly disappeared. Frozen meals and fast food replaced the care and time this dish required. Yet, hidden in the memory of vintage kitchens, chicken a la king in patty shells remains a reminder of an era when homemakers turned leftovers into a showpiece, proving that elegance could be baked right into every shell. Oatmeal pie, poor man's pecan. During the Great Depression and wartime years, when pecans were too expensive for many families, a clever substitute emerged, oatmeal pie, lovingly nicknamed the poor man's pecan. At first glance, it looked just like the Southern classic. A golden crust cradled a filling of sugar, butter, and eggs, baked until rich and gooey. But instead of pricey nuts, homemakers stirred in humble rolled oats. When baked, those oats transformed, soft yet slightly chewy, mimicking the texture of pecans while soaking up the syrupy sweetness. The result was a pie that tasted indulgent but cost only pennies to make. For families who couldn't afford luxuries, this pie carried a quiet dignity. It allowed them to enjoy a dessert that looked and felt like the real thing, served proudly at church suppers, community gatherings, and holiday tables. Children never minded the missing pecans. To them, it was sweet, sticky, and comforting, a slice of celebration in difficult times. This dish also spoke to the creativity of Depression-era cooking. Every ingredient had to be stretched, swapped, or reinvented. Oats, one of the cheapest staples in American pantries, became the unsung hero, turning what might have been an empty dessert plate into something memorable. Though forgotten today, oatmeal pie is more than a recipe. It's a story of resilience, of families finding sweetness when the world seemed bitter. And while modern kitchens lean on convenience and store-bought pies, this vintage dessert reminds us that sometimes, the simplest substitutions create the most heartfelt traditions. One bite of oatmeal pie, and you're not just tasting sugar and oats, you're tasting the resourcefulness of a generation that refused to let hardship steal their joy. Date-nut tea bread. In the cozy kitchens of mid-20th century America, tea time wasn't just about sipping a warm cup, it was about the little loaf cakes and breads that made the moment special. Among them, date-nut tea bread stood out as a favorite, though today it's almost forgotten. This bread wasn't showy or overly sweet. Instead, it was wholesome and hearty, made with chopped dates softened in hot water, then blended with flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous handful of walnuts. Baked in a simple loaf pan, it emerged dense, moist, and aromatic, perfect for slicing thick and serving with butter or cream cheese. Families loved its versatility. It could be served at breakfast, tucked into lunchboxes, or presented on a plate when neighbors dropped by for coffee or tea. Homemakers cherished it for another reason: it felt nourishing. With its chewy dates and crunchy nuts, it carried a sense of substance that made it more than just a treat. For many, date-nut tea bread was also tied to hospitality. Mid-century cookbooks praised it as the ideal companion for afternoon gatherings, the kind of recipe that made guests feel welcome without being extravagant. Children might not have rushed toward its earthy flavors the way they did with cookies, but adults appreciated its quiet sophistication. Today, this bread has slipped out of American kitchens, overshadowed by muffins, banana bread, and packaged snacks. Yet, in its simplicity lies its charm. Every slice tells the story of a time when sharing food was an act of connection, and when even a modest loaf could make a gathering feel warm and special. Forgotten but not gone, date-nut tea bread reminds us that sometimes the most unassuming recipes carry the deepest sense of comfort. Cornflake macaroons. In the decades after World War II, American kitchens embraced convenience like never before. Canned goods, boxed mixes, and ready-to-use cereals found their way into everyday recipes. Out of this wave of creativity came a forgotten gem: cornflake macaroons. This wasn't your typical macaroon. Instead of relying solely on coconut, homemakers folded in crunchy cornflakes to give the cookie a surprising texture and a sweet, toasty flavor. Eggs, sugar, and sometimes a touch of vanilla bound the mixture together, while shredded coconut added chewiness. When baked, the cookies were crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and carried a satisfying crunch that made them irresistible to children. For mothers, they were a dream dessert, quick to make, affordable, and a clever way to use pantry staples. Cornflakes, marketed as a breakfast food, suddenly had a second life as a baking ingredient. Families loved them for bake sales, after-school snacks, and especially holiday cookie trays, where their golden crunch stood out among more traditional sweets. These cookies also reflected the optimism of post-war America. They weren't born from scarcity like Depression-era recipes, but from abundance, a celebration of modern ingredients and the joy of experimenting in the kitchen. Homemakers took pride in serving something a little different, something that felt playful yet comforting. Today, cornflake macaroons have almost disappeared, lost to time and replaced by trendier desserts. But they remain a snapshot of an era when creativity and convenience walked hand in hand. One bite was enough to transport a child straight from the schoolyard to a warm kitchen, where a plate of cookies waited like a hug in edible form. Forgotten but delightful, they remind us that even the simplest cereal could become something magical. 7-Up Lime Mousse. Few desserts capture the playful spirit of mid-century America like the 7-Up Lime Mousse. Born in an era obsessed with gelatin molds, soda pop, and bright colors, this dish was as much a conversation piece as it was a sweet treat. The recipe began with lime jello, its bold green color already promising something fun. Into the mixture went canned pineapple, fluffy whipped cream, and, most surprisingly, a splash of 7-Up. The soda added a fizzy lightness, turning the mousse into something airy, tangy, and refreshing. Once chilled, it was often set in decorative molds, unmolded onto platters, and garnished with cherries or citrus slices, making it the star of any potluck or holiday buffet. For families, this dessert wasn't just about taste, it was about delight. Children marveled at the wiggly, shimmering green towers, while adults enjoyed the cool, creamy sweetness that felt perfect for warm afternoons. In the 1950s and 1960s, when advertisers encouraged homemakers to wow guests with creative uses of everyday products, this mousse felt modern, fun, and a little glamorous. It also carried the optimism of the time. Using soda in a dessert symbolized the era's fascination with convenience, novelty, and innovation. No longer were recipes bound by tradition. Now, even a bottle of 7-Up could become part of a family's cookbook. Today, 7-Up Lime Mousse has mostly vanished, remembered only in faded recipe cards and vintage ads. Modern tastes have shifted away from gelatin-based sweets, but this dish remains a quirky reminder of a time when food was playful, colorful, and proudly experimental. One spoonful was more than dessert, it was a taste of mid-century joy, sparkling with bubbles and memories.